I went to my best friend's house, expecting comfort. Instead, my husband opened the door. For a second, none of us spoke. Behind him stood my best friend, frozen, guilty, exposed. In that silence, everything I believed about my life collapsed at once. I didn't scream. I didn't ask questions. I walked away knowing that betrayal like this doesn't end a life. It rewrites it that I went to my best friend's house because I trusted her. Because she had been the one telling me everything would be fine. Because when my marriage started feeling slightly off, nothing dramatic, just quiet gaps and unexplained absences, she was the person who listened, nodded, reassured me that I was overthinking things. I went there expecting familiarity, comfort, alignment. Instead, my husband opened the door. For a fraction of a second, my mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. Context lagged behind reality. He stood there barefoot, wearing the sweatshirt I had bought him years ago, his expression caught between surprise and calculation. The air behind him smelled wrong. Not like her usual candles. Not like coffee. Something intimate, lived in, recent. Neither of us spoke. That silence was not awkward. It was catastrophic. Over his shoulder, I saw her. My best friend. The woman who knew every private frustration of my marriage, every insecurity I had whispered on late-night calls. She stood frozen in the hallway, her face pale, eyes wide, lips parted as if she were about to explain something that had no explanation. In that moment, nothing dramatic happened. No shouting, no tears, no confrontation. What happened was worse. Everything rearranged itself. Every conversation replayed in my mind at once. Every time she had encouraged me to be patient. Every time she had minimized my concerns. Every moment she had offered to check on him when I was busy. Pieces slid into place with brutal clarity, forming a picture I had never wanted to see. My husband cleared his throat. "This isn't," he started. I held up my hand, not because I was overwhelmed, because I already knew. Knowing is different from hearing. Hearing invites negotiation. Knowing ends it that I looked at him, then at her, and felt something unexpected settle inside me. Not rage, not hysteria, distance. The kind that forms instantly when trust evaporates completely and leaves nothing behind. "I see," I said quietly. My voice surprised even me. Steady, unbroken. She took a step forward. "Please," she said, "let us explain." I didn't respond. There was nothing they could add that would change the shape of what I was seeing. Explanations are for misunderstandings. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a decision they had made repeatedly, comfortably, believing I would never walk through that door. I turned around. Behind me, I heard my husband call my name. Heard her begin to cry. The sounds followed me down the steps and out into the street, but they didn't reach me. Something inside me had gone quiet in a way that felt permanent. I sat in my car and didn't start the engine. I didn't check my phone. I didn't collapse. I stared straight ahead, replaying the image of that door opening over and over again. Not to torture myself, but to understand what had actually happened. This hadn't been a moment of weakness. It had been a pattern. The realization was devastating in its precision. Betrayal like this doesn't feel like chaos. It feels like the sudden absence of a foundation you didn't realize you were standing on until it was gone. I drove home slowly, every street familiar and suddenly foreign. When I walked into my own house, it felt staged, emptied of meaning. These things were still there. Our photos still lined the shelves. But whatever those objects had represented no longer existed. My phone buzzed. Then again, messages from both of them. Apologies. Panic. Requests to talk. I didn't open any of them. That night, I slept without dreaming. Not because I was at peace, because my mind was already working. The shock of that discovery didn't break me. It reorganized me. In the silence that followed, something crucial became clear. They hadn't just betrayed my trust. They had underestimated my ability to respond without emotion leading the way. And that miscalculation would change everything that I didn't wake up the next morning with a plan. I woke up with clarity, which is far more dangerous when people believe you're broken. The house was quiet in that unnatural way it gets when someone expects chaos and instead finds stillness. His side of the bed was empty. He hadn't come home. That fact registered without pain. Pain requires expectation. I no longer had any. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen counter and watched the steam rise, noticing how ordinary everything looked. That ordinariness unsettled me more than any dramatic reaction could have. My life hadn't exploded. It had simply shifted, like a picture knocked slightly crooked on the wall, revealing the nail that had never been centered. My phone was filled with messages. I didn't read them. I didn't need to. I knew the shape of their panic already. Apologies layered with justification. Tears mixed with urgency. Requests to talk framed as concern for me rather than accountability for them. Silence, in that moment, was the only language I trusted. Around noon, my best friend called again. I watched her name light up the screen and felt nothing. Not anger, not nostalgia, absence. That was when I understood how final this was. Love and friendship don't survive the moment they become negotiable. I turned the phone face down and opened my laptop. There are two kinds of people in moments like this: those who collapse inward, and those who step back far enough to see the entire structure that failed them. I chose the second without consciously deciding to. I began pulling records, not obsessively, methodically. Years of shared life documented in agreements, accounts, habits I had once trusted because trust felt easier than verification. The more I looked, the clearer it became. This betrayal hadn't required secrecy because it relied on my assumption of loyalty. They hadn't hidden well. They hadn't needed to. Familiarity had done the work for them. By late afternoon, the messages changed tone. My husband stopped apologizing and started demanding. "We need to talk. You're being dramatic. This isn't fair." Fairness, it seemed, was only relevant when he felt its absence. I finally responded to one message. Just one. 3 words. "I'm not available." That response confused them more than silence. Silence could be interpreted as shock. Unavailability suggested decision. He showed up at the house that evening, unannounced. I saw his car pull into the driveway and felt no surge of adrenaline. Just confirmation. He knocked twice, harder the second time, as if volume might restore access. I opened the door. He looked exhausted, guilty, defensive. All the emotions people wear when they believe they are still entitled to explanation. "Can we talk?" he asked. "No," I said calmly. He blinked. "You can't just." "I can," I replied. "And I am." He tried to step forward. I didn't move. Space matters in moments like this. "You owe me a conversation," he said. I shook my head. "You already had one. You just didn't invite me." That landed harder than shouting ever could have. He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried another approach. Softer. "You're hurting. I get that. But disappearing isn't healthy." I smiled faintly. Disappearing would be avoiding reality. "I'm doing the opposite." He stood there for a long moment, searching my face for something: grief, rage, instability. He found none of it. What he found unsettled him deeply. Behind him, the street was quiet. Ordinary. Life continuing without commentary. "Where are you going?" he asked finally. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "I'm just no longer where you expect me to be." I closed the door gently. That night, I slept again without dreaming. Not because I was numb, because my mind was reorganizing priorities with ruthless efficiency. Betrayal had stripped away illusion, and what remained was something solid enough to build on. They thought my silence meant I was lost. In reality, I had simply stopped letting them write the next chapter, stopped matching. The third day was when I noticed the first real fracture in their version of events. Up until then, they had been operating under a shared assumption that my silence was temporary, that I was retreating to recover, that eventually I would resurface emotional and demanding answers. They expected confrontation because confrontation would give them something to manage, something to negotiate around. Silence, however, gave them nothing to push against, and that unsettled them. It started with inconsistencies. My husband called my sister to say I was taking space. My best friend told someone else I was overwhelmed. Two narratives already diverging. People who tell the truth don't need multiple versions. People who coordinate stories do, and they rarely do it well under pressure. That I heard about this indirectly. A mutual acquaintance reached out cautiously, asking if I was okay. mentioning that she'd heard conflicting things. I didn't correct her. I simply said, I'm handling things privately. That was all. The restraint in my response did more to undermine their story than any explanation ever could. By midday, the messages shifted again. My husband's text softened, less defensive, more uncertain. We need to figure out how to explain this. That single sentence revealed more than he intended. Explain this to whom? And why? Because the story was slipping. Because people were beginning to notice the gap between what they were being told and what was actually happening. My best friend tried a different approach. She sent a long message, heavy with emotion. She framed herself as confused, conflicted, deeply remorseful. She talked about loneliness, about things just happening, about how she never meant to hurt me. What she never did was take responsibility for choosing betrayal over honesty. I didn't respond. I wasn't withholding forgiveness. I was withholding participation. That distinction mattered. That afternoon, I began doing something I hadn't done in years. I paid attention to myself. Not my role, not my obligations. Myself. I went for a long walk without headphones, letting the city noise exist without filtering it out. I noticed how my body felt, tense in some places, surprisingly relaxed in others. I noticed how my thoughts moved, no longer circling around anticipation or damage control. The absence of that mental noise was startling. When I returned home, I opened my laptop again, not to dig for evidence, not to replay conversations, but to assess. There's a kind of power in knowing exactly where you stand before anyone else realizes you've shifted position. I reviewed documents, timelines, shared responsibilities. I wasn't preparing for retaliation. I was preparing for independence. Meanwhile, their urgency escalated. My husband showed up again that evening. This time, he didn't knock. He rang the bell repeatedly, impatience replacing guilt. When I didn't answer, he left messages that veered between frustration and appeal. You're making this worse. We can still fix this. At least talk to me. Fix this. As if betrayal were a mechanical error. I let the phone go silent. Later that night, I received a message from someone I hadn't heard from in years. I ran into her today. It read. She seemed nervous. I almost smiled. Nervousness is the first sign that control is slipping. It means the story no longer feels stable in the teller's hands. I realized then that something important had shifted, not externally, internally. I no longer felt the need to correct them, to confront them, to expose anything. Exposure was unnecessary. Time would do the work far more efficiently. They had underestimated one thing above all else: my ability to remain composed without compliance. They had mistaken emotional restraint for emotional dependence. They believed that because I didn't explode, I would eventually fold. They were wrong. That night, as I turned off the lights and settled into bed, I felt a calm I hadn't expected to feel so soon. Not relief, not closure, readiness. The shock of seeing my husband open that door had changed my life forever. Not because it destroyed something, but because it stripped away the final illusion I had been living under. Trust, once broken so cleanly, does not beg to be repaired. It steps aside and lets truth move forward. And truth, unlike lies, does not need coordination to survive. On the fourth day, something subtle but decisive happened. It wasn't dramatic. No confrontation, no revelation, no message that changed everything. It was simply the moment I realized I was no longer reachable in the way they expected me to be. Reachability is a kind of permission. It tells people where they can find you emotionally, how far they can push before you respond, how much access they still have even after they've crossed a line. For years, I had been reachable by default. As a wife, as a friend, as the person who smoothed things over, who absorbed discomfort so others didn't have to sit with it. That version of reachability ended quietly. I noticed it when my phone rang, and I didn't feel the reflex to answer or silence it immediately. I let it ring while I finished what I was doing. The sound no longer felt urgent. It was just noise. That was new. The call was from my husband. Again, he left a voicemail this time, his tone carefully controlled. I don't know what you think you're doing, he said, but this isn't helping anyone. You're making things worse by refusing to communicate. Worse for whom, I wondered. Certainly not for me. What he meant was that my absence was removing the pressure valve that had always protected him from consequences. Without my participation, there was no one translating his choices into something palatable. No one softening the impact. No one managing the optics. I deleted the voicemail without replaying it. Later that afternoon, my best friend tried a new tactic. She didn't call. She didn't text. She sent an email, long, carefully structured, almost formal. It was an apology designed to look reflective without actually conceding anything of substance. She talked about how complicated feelings had developed, how she had been in a bad place, how she hoped we could eventually talk this through. The subtext was clear. She wanted reassurance that I still existed in her life, in some capacity, that I was still reachable. I closed the email without replying. What they didn't understand yet was that silence was not a waiting room. It wasn't a pause before reconciliation. It was a boundary being installed in real time. That evening, I made a list, not of grievances, not of betrayals, but of facts. Tangible, verifiable facts about my life. What I owned, what I contributed, what I had postponed, what I had tolerated. Seeing it all laid out stripped away any lingering doubt. I wasn't reacting impulsively. I was responding proportionally. I went to bed early and slept deeply for the first time since the discovery. Not because things were resolved, but because something inside me had settled. My nervous system was no longer bracing for interaction. It had accepted a new baseline. The next morning, I woke to a different tone in the messages I hadn't read. The urgency had sharpened. My husband's texts were shorter, more pointed. We need to decide what we're telling people. This is starting to look bad. You can't just disappear. Disappear. That word again. As if my refusal to engage was an act of aggression rather than self-preservation. I finally responded. One sentence. I'm not managing the narrative for you anymore. The reply came instantly. That's not what I meant. Of course it was. That single exchange marked a turning point. After that, the attempts to reach me became less frequent, but more erratic. They were no longer coordinated. Sometimes apologetic, sometimes accusatory, sometimes oddly casual, as if normalcy could be re-established by pretending nothing had fundamentally changed. But it had. I noticed how quickly people recalibrate when they realize access has been revoked. The tone shifts, the entitlement cracks, the assumptions collapse. My best friend stopped contacting me entirely after that. I suspect she finally understood that whatever we had was not salvageable by proximity or shared history. My husband tried one last time to appeal to my sense of responsibility. Think about everything we've built, he wrote. Throwing it away over one mistake doesn't make sense. One mistake. I didn't respond. I had stopped being reachable, and with that, I had stopped being negotiable. The life we had built was not something he could reference as leverage anymore. It was something I could evaluate freely without obligation. And when evaluated honestly, it was clear. What I was losing was not a marriage or a friendship. It was a role that required me to accept betrayal quietly so others could remain comfortable. That was not a loss. That was a release. By the fifth day, the emotional landscape had changed in a way I hadn't anticipated. The sharp edges of shock were gone, replaced by something steadier. What surprised me most wasn't the absence of sadness, but the absence of guilt. For years, guilt had been my default response to conflict. If something went wrong, I looked inward first. What could I have done differently? What I missed? How could I fix this without making things worse for everyone else? That reflex was gone. In its place was a quiet understanding. Guilt only thrives where responsibility has been distorted. I had been carrying weight that was never mine to hold, and once I put it down, there was no ache in my hands, only relief. I noticed it when I thought about my best friend and felt nothing tug at me. No urge to check on her, no curiosity about how she was doing. The bond weed had dissolved instantly, not because I hardened myself, but because it had been built on a premise that no longer existed. Friendship doesn't survive when loyalty becomes conditional. I also noticed how little I thought about explanations. I didn't rehearse conversations in my head anymore. I didn't imagine what I would say if we ever talked again. That mental energy had been quietly draining me for years, and now it was simply available. I used it. I took care of practical matters with efficiency that surprised even me. I made appointments. I organized documents. I put plans in motion without announcing them to anyone. There was power in acting without needing approval, in making decisions that didn't require consensus or justification. Meanwhile, the outside noise continued to shift. Mutual acquaintances stopped asking how I was and started asking what was going on. The subtle difference mattered. Concern had turned into curiosity. The story was no longer stable enough to be absorbed without question. People sensed that something didn't add up, and in that vacuum, speculation grew. I didn't fill it. My husband tried again that evening, this time with a different tone. Resigned, almost reflective. He sent a message that said, "I know I messed up, but I never thought you'd cut me out completely." Cut you out. The phrasing was telling. He still saw my withdrawal as an action against him, rather than a decision for myself. That framing revealed how deeply he had relied on my presence as a given. Not chosen, assumed. I typed a response and deleted it twice before settling on the truth. I didn't cut you out. I stepped back from something that no longer included respect. He didn't reply. That silence felt different. It wasn't strategic. It was unsettled. That night, I went out alone for the first time since everything happened. Not to distract myself, not to prove anything, but because I wanted to. I sat at a small table, ordered dinner without considering anyone else's preferences, and noticed how easily I inhabited my own space. No performance, no scanning the room, no anticipation of someone else's needs. It felt unfamiliar in the best way. On my way home, I realized something quietly profound. The worst part of the betrayal hadn't been the act itself. It had been the realization of how much of myself I had been giving away to people who felt entitled to it. Once that became clear, there was no temptation to negotiate my return. The space where guilt used to live was now empty. And in that emptiness, something stronger was forming. Not anger, not vengeance. Ownership. Ownership of my time. Ownership of my attention. Ownership of the story I would live next. They had mistaken my generosity for permanence. My patience for permission. My silence for weakness. Those misunderstandings had cost them access they would never regain. As I turned off the lights and settled into bed that night, I didn't wonder what would happen next. I already knew. Whatever came, it would not require me to disappear to make it easier for someone else to stand. The realization didn't hit them all at once. It arrived unevenly, like an echo moving through different rooms at different speeds. But when it did, it changed the tone of everything. I could tell by the way the messages stopped trying to pull me back and started trying to assess damage. My husband didn't ask how I was anymore. He asked what I was doing, where I was staying, whether I'd spoken to anyone. Those questions weren't concern. They were inventory checks. He was trying to determine how much control he had already lost. My best friend didn't reach out at all. Her silence was not respectful. It was fearful. She had always thrived on proximity, on shared history, on the comfort of being needed. Without access to me, she had nothing to anchor herself to. And worse, nothing to reassure her that the version of herself she wanted others to believe and would hold that I heard through someone else that she had started telling people she was giving me space. That phrase made me almost laugh. Space is something you offer when you expect to be invited back. What I had created was distance, and distance doesn't require permission. The shift became obvious the day my husband showed up again, this time without urgency, without anger, without guilt. He stood at the door like someone approaching a closed chapter, not a conflict. "You're serious," he said. "Yes," I replied. There was no drama in the exchange, just acknowledgement, the kind that lands when denial has finally exhausted itself. He looked at me for a long moment, as if trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the version he believed he knew. "You're really not going to try to fix this," he said. That I shook my head. "I'm fixing myself. That's different." He exhaled slowly. "I didn't think it would end like this." I met his gaze. It didn't end like this. It led here. That distinction mattered. Endings feel abrupt. Consequences feel earned. After that conversation, something loosened in me completely. The last thread of obligation snapped quietly, without pain. I realized I was no longer waiting for anything from them. Not understanding, not remorse, not closure. The chapter had already closed on my side. They were just catching up. The outside world adjusted too. People stopped reaching out with vague concern and started behaving as though a line had been drawn. Some disappeared entirely. Others became cautious, uncertain how to place themselves now that I was no longer playing my familiar role. I welcomed the uncertainty. It filtered out relationships built on assumption rather than respect. I spent more time alone, not in isolation, but in alignment. I began to recognize how often my past life had required me to shrink slightly, to accommodate emotional laziness, to absorb discomfort so others could remain unchallenged. That labor had been invisible, but its absence was unmistakable. One afternoon, I ran into someone who had known all three of us for years. She hesitated before speaking, then said, "I never thought you'd be the one to walk away." I smiled softly. Neither did I. That was the truth. I had built my identity around endurance, around loyalty, around staying. Walking away didn't feel like strength when I imagined it. It felt like failure. But now, standing firmly in the aftermath, I understood how wrong that assumption had been. Staying had been the easy option. It had required silence, accommodation, and self-erasure. Leaving required clarity, restraint, and the courage to let others misunderstand me. That courage changed everything. I stopped explaining myself, even in my own thoughts. I stopped rehearsing defenses for decisions that didn't require justification. I trusted my own perception fully for the first time in a long while. That trust was the real turning point. Because once you trust yourself completely, betrayal loses its power to define you. The people who had hurt me were now navigating the consequences of their choices without my emotional labor cushioning the impact. That wasn't cruelty. It was reality. And reality, once faced, demands growth or collapse. As for me, I was already moving forward. Not loudly, not vindicatively, but decisively. They had finally realized I wasn't coming back. And by the time they did, I had already built a life that no longer needed them to make sense. What followed my departure wasn't dramatic, but it was destabilizing in a way they hadn't anticipated. When people believe they've managed a situation, they relax. They rely on familiar patterns to reassert themselves. When those patterns don't respond, anxiety creeps in, followed by missteps. That's what happened to them. Without my participation, their version of events began to unravel under its own weight. Not because I corrected it, but because maintaining a lie requires coordination, and coordination requires trust. They had already proven they didn't possess that. My husband started contradicting himself in small ways. One day he told someone I was taking time to cool off. Another day he said I was focused on work. Eventually, the inconsistencies stacked up. People noticed. Not dramatically, but quietly, the way adults do when they sense something is off and stop investing emotionally. My best friend withdrew almost completely from social spaces we once shared. She declined invitations, avoided questions. When she did appear, she looked brittle, overaware of herself. Guilt doesn't always present as remorse. Sometimes it shows up as hypervigilance, the fear that someone, somewhere, sees through you. I didn't need to be present for that process. It happened organically, fueled by the absence of the one person who had always smoothed the narrative. I heard about it secondhand, in fragments. He seems lost. She's not herself lately. Comments that would have once pulled me into concern now passed through me without sticking. I wasn't indifferent. I was detached. There's a difference. Detachment isn't coldness. It's clarity without entanglement. The more distance I maintained, the more my own life expanded. I accepted invitations I would have declined before. I pursued ideas I had shelved because they didn't fit the life I was expected to maintain. I noticed how much energy I had been spending on containment rather than creation. One evening, while out with acquaintances who knew nothing of my situation, I laughed freely for the first time in weeks. The sound surprised me. It wasn't forced or performative. It came from a place of ease I had forgotten existed. That was when I understood something crucial. Healing doesn't always feel like recovery. Sometimes it feels like discovery. Meanwhile, the attempts to regain control escalated briefly, then fizzled. My husband sent a message asking if we could present a united front, an upcoming event. I declined without explanation. My best friend asked through mutual contact if I was open to closure. I said no. Closure is a luxury people seek when they want relief without responsibility. I didn't know anyone that. What I owed myself was continuity of values, of boundaries, of self-respect. And continuity doesn't come from revisiting places where trust was broken. It comes from moving forward without dragging old wounds behind you. I noticed how my internal dialogue had changed. I no longer questioned whether I was being fair. Fairness had been weaponized against me too often. Instead, I asked a simpler question: does this require me to abandon myself? If the answer was yes, the decision was already made. That question guided everything. The fallout they experienced wasn't catastrophic. It was cumulative. Misconnections, awkward silences, the slow realization that life without my stabilizing presence was messier, less forgiving. They weren't punished. They were simply no longer protected. Protection, I learned, is a form of love that becomes harmful when it's unreciprocated. One afternoon, as I reviewed plans for the months ahead, I felt a deep sense of alignment. Not joy exactly, but rightness. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles into your bones and stays. They had tried to control the aftermath by managing perception. I had opted out of the entire game. And in doing so, I had reclaimed something far more valuable than reputation or reassurance. I had reclaimed agency. Agency over my time. Agency over my narrative. Agency over who had access to me. That agency changed everything, not just for me, but for the people who had assumed it would always be available to them. The aftermath they couldn't control wasn't chaos. It was my absence. And it was teaching them lessons I had no interest in explaining. That IT happened on an ordinary morning, the kind that used to blur into every other day when my life revolved around managing everyone else's emotions. I was standing by the window, watching light move across the floor, when I realized something with startling clarity. I hadn't thought about them in hours. Not in a deliberate way. Not as an act of resistance. I simply hadn't looked back. That was new. Before, even in my silence, there had been a backward pull, a checking impulse, a faint awareness running in the background, tracking their reactions, their discomfort, their attempts to regain footing. That impulse was gone, and its absence felt like breathing after holding air in your lungs for far too long. I didn't celebrate the realization. I noted it, like a scientist observing a shift in conditions. I went about my day without adjusting anything to accommodate the past. I made decisions based on interest, not fallout. I accepted an invitation without wondering who might see it or what it might imply. I chose clothing because it felt like me, not because it fit a version of myself someone else expected. That freedom was subtle, but it accumulated quickly. Later that day, I ran into someone who knew all of us. She looked at me with a mix of curiosity and caution. "You seem lighter," she said, then quickly added, "I mean that in a good way." "I know," I replied. She hesitated, then asked, "Do you miss them?" The question was sincere, not accusatory, not gossip-driven. I appreciated that. I thought for a moment. "I miss who I thought they were," I said, "not who they chose to be." That distinction felt important. Missing an illusion is not the same as longing for a return. She nodded slowly, as if that answered something she hadn't known how to articulate. We talked about other things after that. Work, travel, ordinary life. I noticed how easily the conversation flowed when I wasn't filtering myself through caution or loyalty to people who weren't present. When I got home, my phone buzzed. A message from my husband. Short, neutral. "I'm moving some things out next week. I'll coordinate with you." No apology, no accusation, just logistics. I read it once and put the phone down. That message marked the official end of something, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt procedural, like closing an account that no longer served a purpose. The emotional closure had already happened weeks earlier, quietly, without fanfare. I realized then that the most painful part of betrayal isn't the act itself. It's the prolonged period afterward where you're expected to carry both your own grief and the discomfort of the people who caused it. Once you stop doing that, healing accelerates. That evening, I went for a walk as the sun was setting. The city hummed around me, indifferent to my personal history. That indifference was comforting. It reminded me that my life was larger than the worst thing that had happened to me. I thought back to the moment at the door. The shock. The sudden collapse of certainty. At the time, it had felt like the end of something irreplaceable. Now, standing firmly in a life shaped by choice rather than obligation, I saw it differently. That door hadn't ended my life. It had released it. The people who betrayed me were now part of a story I no longer inhabited. They could interpret my absence however they liked. They could call it cold, dramatic, unforgiving. None of those interpretations required my involvement. I had stopped looking back. And when you stop looking back, you realize how much of your energy had been spent orienting yourself around people who were never facing you in the first place. That night, as I turned out the lights, I felt a quiet certainty settle in. Not triumph, not revenge. Certainty. Whatever came next would be built on truth, not tolerance. And I would never again mistake silence for weakness or loyalty for self-erasure. What they never anticipated was how quickly the world adjusts when you stop holding it in place. I didn't announce changes. I didn't make statements. I simply began living as if my life belonged to me alone, which I realized it finally did. And that quiet shift set off consequences they couldn't control or reverse. My husband discovered this first. Without my presence, decisions that once felt automatic now required effort. Social plans stalled. Invitations stopped coming. Not because people had taken sides, but because I had always been the bridge, the one who remembered birthdays, followed up, maintained warmth. Without that bridge, relationships didn't collapse, but they thinned. And thin relationships don't support weight. He called once, frustrated but careful. People are acting strange, he said, like they don't know where to place me. I almost told him the truth, that people didn't know where to place him because the version of him they knew had always been contextual, anchored to me. But I didn't say it. Some realizations have to arrive without explanation to take root. My best friend experienced the fallout differently. Her social circle shifted subtly, but unmistakably. Invitations became fewer. Conversations shorter. Trust, once assumed, was now evaluated. People who betray quietly are rarely believed loudly, but they are remembered, especially by those who once benefited from proximity to the person betrayed. I heard she tried to reach out to mutual acquaintances for reassurance. Tried to frame the situation as complicated and mutual. But complication doesn't excuse duplication, and mutual implies consent. Neither applied. I didn't need to clarify anything. Time clarified it for me. Meanwhile, my own life expanded in ways I hadn't predicted. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. Opportunities arose that required presence, not performance. I found myself invited into conversations where my perspective mattered without being filtered through someone else's narrative. That shift felt profound. I noticed how often I was listened to now, really listened to. Not because I'd become more articulate, but because I was no longer deluded by compromise. People respond to wholeness. They sense when someone is no longer negotiating their worth in the room. One afternoon, a colleague asked how I'd managed to stay so composed through everything. I considered the question before answering honestly. I stopped trying to be understood, I said, and started being aligned. That alignment had ripple effects. My husband tried once more to re-establish familiarity. A casual message, a shared memory referenced lightly, as if nostalgia might reopen a door. I responded politely but distantly. The boundary was clear now, and he felt it. I didn't think it would change this much, he admitted during our last logistical conversation. Neither did I replied. But I didn't realize how much of it was being held together by me. That was the moment I saw it land. Not as accusation, as realization. The betrayal that had changed my life forever wasn't just about infidelity, or broken trust. It was about discovering how much invisible labor I had been doing to maintain a reality that benefited everyone except me. Once that labor stopped, the structure didn't fall dramatically. It simply revealed itself as unsustainable. That revelation didn't make me bitter. It made me free. They had expected confrontation, tears, recrimination, a mess they could respond to. What they got instead was withdrawal, calm, continuity without them. And that was the consequence they never expected. Because nothing unsettles people more than realizing you were essential and chose to stop. There's a strange moment that comes after loss when you realize you're no longer surviving it. You are living beyond it. I didn't mark that moment with a date or a decision. It revealed itself gradually through ease, through the absence of resistance, through the quiet confidence of knowing I didn't owe anyone an explanation for the direction my life was taking. I stopped framing my days around recovery. I wasn't healing anymore. I was building. I noticed it first in how I planned. I made choices without scanning for repercussions. I booked travel without considering who might be upset by my absence. I rearranged my home without wondering whether someone else would approve. The space I lived in began to reflect me, not compromise. That shift felt radical in its simplicity. My phone rang less often, and when it did, it was because someone wanted my presence, not my compliance. That distinction mattered. I had spent years confusing obligation for connection. Now I could feel the difference immediately. People began to interact with me differently too. Not cautiously, not tiptoeing around my history, but directly. As if something in my posture had signaled that I was no longer available for projection or assumption. I didn't invite questions about the past, and no one pushed for them. The clarity I carried did the work for me. Occasionally, information drifted back to me about my husband or my former best friend. Not gossip, just facts. He was still unsettled. She had moved. Life had not collapsed for them, but it hadn't improved either. It had narrowed. The kind of narrowing that happens when choices limit options rather than expand them. I felt no satisfaction in that knowledge. Indifference, I learned, is not cruelty. It's resolution. I thought often about the version of myself who had walked up to that door expecting comfort and found betrayal instead. I wanted to tell her something, that the shock she felt would not define her, that the stillness she chose would become her strength, that she would one day look back and see that moment not as the end, but as the precise beginning of a life she hadn't known she was allowed to claim. What surprised me most was how little I missed the life I had lost. I missed the idea of it, the promise, the potential, but not the reality. The reality had been heavy with accommodation, quiet resentment, and unspoken compromise. Once those weights were gone, there was room for something else to take shape. I became more selective with my time, with my attention, with the people I allowed close. I learned that boundaries are not walls. They are filters. They let in what nourishes and keep out what drains. That understanding reshaped every relationship I had. I also learned that forgiveness is not something you grant to restore access. It's something you give yourself to release attachment. I forgave them quietly, without ceremony. Not because they asked, but because I didn't want to carry them any longer. Forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. It meant freedom from replay. As my life continued to unfold, I felt something settle into permanence. A sense of authorship. I was no longer reacting to events written by someone else. I was choosing direction, tone, pace. That autonomy felt expansive, almost unfamiliar at first. One evening, while standing on my balcony watching the city lights come on one by one, I realized something with calm certainty. Betrayal had not taken anything from me that mattered. It had removed what was false, what was conditional, what required me to shrink to maintain. In doing so, it had returned me to myself, unfiltered, undiluted, unapologetic. I didn't rebuild my life loudly. I didn't announce milestones or seek validation. I simply lived. And in that living, I discovered a version of myself who no longer needed to be chosen, defended, or explained. That version of me was enough. And she was finally freed at IT happened months later, when the distance had settled into something permanent and undeniable. The urgency was gone. The chaos had quieted. And that was precisely when they tried to rewrite history. It always happens that way. When people realize they can't pull you back into the story, they try to reshape the story itself. Not for you, for themselves. To soothe their conscience. To soften the edges of what they did. To make the ending feel less final. I heard about it through someone else. A casual comment, delivered without intent. He said you two had grown apart for a long time, she told me. That it was mutual. Mutual. That word again. It appeared often when people wanted to distribute responsibility without actually examining it. Mutual suggests agreement, symmetry, shared intent. None of those had existed. What had existed was secrecy, entitlement, and a belief that I would absorb the shock quietly. I didn't correct the narrative. I had learned by then that correcting history requires standing inside it again. I had no interest in returning to a place that no longer reflected who I was. Soon after, my former best friend tried the same approach. She framed the betrayal as a complicated situation that spiraled. She spoke about guilt, confusion, emotional overlap. She avoided the simplest truth, that she had chosen proximity to my husband over loyalty to me. Complication is a convenient disguise for choice. They both wanted absolution without accountability. Rewriting history was their way of seeking it. What surprised me was how little it affected me. Months earlier, hearing those distortions would have ignited something in me. A need to defend myself, to assert reality, to make sure people knew the truth. Now it barely registered. The version of me who needed to be understood had already moved on. I had become grounded in something deeper than reputation. Truth doesn't require witnesses to exist. I noticed how differently people responded to their rewritten narratives compared to before. There was politeness, neutrality, but not conviction. People nodded, but they didn't lean in. They listened, but they didn't internalize. The story lacked weight because the person who could have anchored it, me, was absent. And absence speaks louder than defense ever could. One afternoon, I ran into someone who had known us all well. She studied me for a moment before speaking. "You seem settled," she said. "Whatever happened, you seem like you landed on your feet." I smiled. I landed on myself. She nodded slowly. "That makes sense." That exchange told me everything I needed to know. The truth had traveled quietly, without explanation, carried by consistency rather than argument. People believe patterns. They trust outcomes. And the outcome was visible. My life was expansive, calm, directed. Theirs was contained, defensive, preoccupied with explanation. That contrast did the work for me. I reflected often on how betrayal exposes not just who others are, but who you have been allowing yourself to be. I had allowed access without discernment, loyalty without reciprocity, silence without respect. Walking away had forced a recalibration, not just of relationships, but of self-perception. I no longer saw myself as someone who endured. I saw myself as someone who chose. That distinction mattered. When they realized I wasn't returning, not emotionally, not narratively, not historically, they stopped trying to reach me altogether. There was nothing left to negotiate, no space to reinterpret, no role for me to play. And in that final absence, something solidified. I had outgrown the need to be right. I had outgrown the need to be vindicated. I had outgrown the need to be remembered the way they wanted to remember me. What remained was something far more powerful. A life that no longer revolved around betrayal, because it no longer revolved around them. There is a quiet kind of freedom that comes only after detachment, and it feels nothing like the dramatic independence people imagine. It isn't loud. It isn't defiant. It's calm, steady, and deeply internal. I didn't wake up one day feeling triumphant. I woke up feeling unburdened. Detachment didn't mean I stopped caring. It meant I stopped carrying. I noticed it in small moments. In how my thoughts no longer drifted toward imagined conversations or delayed responses. In how my body felt lighter, less tense, no longer bracing for disappointment or emotional labor. I had been holding my breath for years without realizing it, and now I was finally exhaling. The absence of their presence created space I hadn't known how to occupy at first. Silence can feel unfamiliar when you've spent your life managing noise. But gradually, that space filled itself, not with distraction, but with intention. I learned to listen to myself again, to trust my instincts without filtering them through someone else's expectations. I stopped asking questions that didn't serve me. Why did they do it? How long did it last? What were they thinking? Those questions lead nowhere. They only tether you to people who have already shown you who they are. Instead, I asked better ones. What do I want now? What feels honest? What no longer fits? Those answers reshaped everything. I rebuilt routines that belonged solely to me. Mornings that weren't rushed. Evenings that weren't spent recovering from emotional depletion. I filled my time with things that nourished rather than drained. Conversations that felt mutual, work that felt meaningful, solitude that felt restorative instead of lonely. People noticed the change, even when they didn't know its source. They commented on my calm, on my clarity, on the way I seemed grounded in myself. What they were responding to was detachment, not coldness, but self-possession. I realized then that detachment is often misunderstood. It's not indifference, it's discernment. It's the ability to care without sacrificing yourself, to engage without disappearing. It's choosing peace over proximity when proximity costs too much. The past no longer felt heavy. It felt instructive. I could see the signs I had ignored. The moments where loyalty had been one-sided. The times I had chosen comfort over truth, silence over self-respect. Those realizations didn't shame me. They educated me. They gave me language for boundaries I hadn't known how to articulate before. I stopped romanticizing endurance. Endurance is only admirable when it leads somewhere worth arriving. Staying in situations that diminish you is not strength. It's self-abandonment dressed up as loyalty. The freedom that followed detachment wasn't dramatic. It was sustainable. I didn't need closure from them because I had clarity within myself. I didn't need apologies to validate my experience. I didn't need acknowledgement to move forward. My life no longer depended on their understanding. One afternoon, while sitting alone in a quiet cafe, I watched people pass by and felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not for the betrayal, but for the awakening it forced. Without it, I might have continued shrinking, calling it compromise. I might have mistaken endurance for love indefinitely. Instead, I had stepped into something better. A life where my presence was chosen, not assumed. A life where my boundaries were respected because they were enforced. A life where peace wasn't fragile or conditional. Detachment didn't make me colder. It made me whole. There's a moment that arrives quietly, long after the crisis has passed, when you finally understand that you didn't just survive what happened. You outgrew it. Betrayal changes people in two directions. Some become smaller, guarded, brittle. Others become clearer, more exact, less willing to tolerate what once seemed acceptable. I became the second. The version of me that survived the betrayal was not hardened, but sharpened. I no longer blurred lines for the sake of harmony. I no longer translated bad behavior into palatable explanations. I no longer mistook history for entitlement. What survived was discernment. I could feel in my body, in how quickly I recognized discomfort now, and how decisively I responded to it. I didn't wait for proof. I didn't ask for permission. If something felt misaligned, I stepped back without apology. That shift changed every interaction. New people entered my life without the weight of my past attached to them. I didn't lead with my story. I didn't frame myself as someone who had been hurt. I led with who I was now, self-contained, observant, calm. People responded differently to that energy. There was respect in the way they listened, caution in the way they approached, ease in the way conversations unfolded without performance. I noticed how rarely I explained myself anymore. Not because I was evasive, but because my actions spoke clearly. I showed up where I was valued. I withdrew where I was not. That consistency became my language. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of the old me, hesitating before saying no, considering someone else's comfort before my own. But those moments passed quickly. They were echoes, not instincts. The muscle memory of self-abandonment had weakened. I reflected often on what betrayal had revealed beyond the obvious. It had shown me how deeply I had been socialized to preserve relationships at any cost. How much I had believed that loyalty required silence, that grace required endurance, that love meant accommodating disrespect. Letting go of those beliefs felt like shedding armor I had mistaken for skin. The people who betrayed me continued to live their lives, altered but intact. I didn't wish them harm. I didn't wish them well either. I wished them accountability, which is something no one can give another person. They would either find it or avoid it. That was no longer my concern. What mattered was the life I was building now. I chose relationships deliberately. I valued transparency over intensity. I paid attention to patterns rather than promises. I trusted myself enough to walk away early without needing betrayal as justification. That was the true transformation. One evening, as I stood in my living room, surrounded by a life that felt entirely mine, I realized something quietly profound. The worst thing that had ever happened to me had not broken me. It had revealed me. It had stripped away roles I had been playing unconsciously. It had removed people who relied on my silence to maintain their comfort. It had forced me to confront myself without distraction. And what I found was someone capable, someone grounded, someone unwilling to disappear for the sake of belonging. The betrayal that had changed my life forever did not define my ending. It defined my beginning, not as a victim, not as a survivor, but as a woman who finally chose herself without negotiation. The final realization came without drama, the way the most important truths often do. I was sitting alone one evening, the room quiet, my thoughts unoccupied, when it occurred to me that my life no longer revolved around what had happened. The betrayal was no longer the center of the story. It was simply a chapter, closed, finished, no longer referenced. That was how I knew I had crossed the last threshold. I hadn't just healed. I had moved on in a way that didn't require forgetting, forgiving loudly, or rewriting the past into something more comfortable. I had integrated the truth and built forward from it. The life I was living now was not a reaction. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't proof of resilience. It was alignment. Everything in it made sense to me. My days had a rhythm that felt natural rather than enforced. My relationships were reciprocal rather than draining. My decisions were guided by clarity instead of fear. I no longer waited for signs that I was safe to be myself. I assumed it and acted accordingly. I understood now that betrayal doesn't destroy people. It exposes structures that were never sustainable to begin with. The marriage had relied on my trust without honoring it. The friendship had relied on my loyalty without reciprocating it. Once exposed, those structures collapsed on their own. I didn't push them. I stepped away and let gravity do the rest. What replaced them wasn't emptiness. It was discernment. I knew what I would no longer tolerate, but more importantly, I knew what I required. Respect, honesty, presence. Anything less simply didn't enter my life anymore. I thought back to the moment I stood at that door, stunned, silent, absorbing the sight of two people I loved standing together in betrayal. At the time, it felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. Now I understood that the ground hadn't vanished. It had shifted. It had moved me away from a life that demanded my silence and toward one that honored my voice, even when I chose not to use it. I had learned that silence can be a choice, not a surrender. That walking away can be an act of power, not loss. That trust, once broken, doesn't need to be repaired to be released. Most of all, I learned that my life was never dependent on their loyalty to continue. It was dependent on my loyalty to myself. The betrayal changed my life forever, but not in the way people expect. It didn't make me bitter. It didn't make me cynical. It made me exact, clear, unavailable to anything that required me to shrink to be accepted. I didn't get revenge. I didn't get closure from them. I got something far better. I got myself back, undivided, unburdened, and finally free. They thought betrayal would break me, that discovering the truth at that door would leave me desperate, reactive, diminished. What they never understood was that betrayal doesn't destroy a life, it clarifies it. It shows you exactly who no longer deserves access, exactly what was holding you back, and exactly how strong you've always been when you stop apologizing for choosing yourself. I didn't walk away empty-handed. I walked away awake. And once you're awake, you never beg to be loved by people who are comfortable lying to you.